Hey everyone, and welcome to the very latest edition of DF Direct Weekly, number 61. It's our weekly show where we talk about the latest gaming and technology news. A packed week full of interesting discussion points this week, plenty of controversy. Joining me to talk about it, first of all, John Linneman.
Welcome back, Rich. It was empty here without you last week, but we had a nice time with Oliver, but still, you're always missed.
I'm sure you coped.
I mean, you saw the episode.
Absolutely.
We did okay.
And of course, Tom Morgan.
Yeah, I'm very excited to be here this week. It's been a little while, I think. Just wanted to say hello once again from a new angle as well. So
it's good to have you, Tom, because yes, it has been a while. So it's a fun kind of, we're changing things up this week. Alex is busy on assignment.
He is producing, he's on the tail end at the moment of producing the FSR 2.0 video. But it's going to be awesome. But let's crack on with the show. So first discussion point, we had this rather bizarre situation where if you're an Xbox owner, for a period of time, I think some people have said up to 4 days, they couldn't actually play games on it, which as a concept is kind of mind-blowing, right? The reason why was simply that Xbox has quite a complex online DRM system that essentially requires you to be connected to the internet to play games. Now, the thing about an internet connection is it has to be talking to something, and obviously something was amiss at the Xbox servers. And basically people were locked out of their games, even single-player content that had no online component whatsoever. This is utterly bizarre and kind of unacceptable, right, John?
Yeah, but it's very complex, actually. There's a lot of nuance behind this that I think is worth discussing. So, obviously just having an outage for a few days is, in my opinion, not a big deal like this, right? You'll eventually get it back. But this does highlight the long-term issue with the current Xbox platform, wherein essentially this DRM means that without servers, the system isn't usable. And I say this as somebody that's an avid retro gamer, of course. So I am regularly buying and playing games from like 30 years ago, often older even. So that does actually matter to me, and it does matter to others. I know not everybody's into that, but so here's the thing. Now, obviously, if you're buying digital games or you're playing on Game Pass, it absolutely does make sense to have some sort of online check, right? You don't want to just be able to illegally or do whatever, they want you to be able to play this stuff legit, and that's fair. The issue here is that they actually do have a solution in place for the digital games, but it doesn't work as reliably as you might hope. And by that, I mean, you can first of all, you need to set your Xbox console as the home console. Any other console that's not the home console will always require a check-in when starting a game. That's exactly how it works on PlayStation and Switch. Now, with the home console, theoretically, everything should start no matter what. But what we found was that when the servers went down, that wasn't always the case. And it does seem to have been related to the difference between offline mode and regular mode, and that going offline seems to trigger something on the server side that essentially allows you to use the licenses without a check-in. I don't know for how long. It should be indefinitely, but I'm not sure it works that way. But if you were not in offline mode when the servers went down, you essentially lose that connection, and even trying to go offline doesn't fix it. So you're stuck, and some games won't start. Others did. So, but that's something I think that could be adjusted and fixed a little bit, perhaps. The bigger problem from my perspective is the way physical media works, and that essentially, if you're playing on an Xbox Series X, it is entirely possible that most of your disc-based games won't be playable and you can't install them. And the reason is pretty simple. So it comes down to smart delivery. Now, if you have a native Xbox Series X game disc, I think the one that's always kind of thrown around is Devil May Cry 5 Special Edition, that actually got a real Series X disc. No Xbox One on that disc. That will install and play completely offline, no problem at all. It's exactly the way it should work. The problem is when you insert any game that has smart delivery features. So, like, let's say you bought just about any game, really, like Tales of Arise, Hitman, something like that, and you pop it in, you're offline, there's no connection to the server, the Xbox still knows that you're trying to play an Xbox One game because that's what's on the disc. There's no Series X game on the disc. And it wants to connect to a server. And that's basically it. You're stuck. You can't play the game. We actually found that sometimes, even if you had the game pre-installed, it still won't start in that form. So that's a problem. And I think that smart delivery is partially to blame here, and it comes down to the way it's implemented. It makes sense for online content, but for disc-based content, I think they should allow you to just install whatever's on the disc and use it on any console, period, right? If you want to play the Xbox One version, you should be able to do that because there are still inherent benefits to doing so, right? You get potential performance boosts. This is how it works on the PS5. You just insert any PS4 game. You can be fully offline. You never have to connect. They will all install and run. Now, there has been some muddying in the water because there are some games on other platforms that do have online checks, like Diablo 2, some of the Call of Duty stuff, Gran Turismo 7. These games are also a problem because they actually do have online DRM. But aside from them, on Switch and PlayStation consoles, all your physical media will work offline. So that's kind of a long-winded explanation, but that's kind of the situation, that not all your physical media will run correctly, and there's weirdness with the offline mode that can cause some people to lose access. Some of this can be fixed. Some of it I don't think they will fix, but that's kind of the state of things.
Okay. Tom, any thoughts on this?
Well, I think John summarized it really well. Like, I'm just glad that, I mean, Microsoft's obviously on the case, and they're like issuing a short-term fix to make sure people can buy games as well as play them. But it's like, it's a bit like you need to have enough of an event of this sort of moment to get people thinking, well, actually, I need to be complaining more about it. Because, you know, people are seeing the consequence of their DRM approach right now. But when things have been evened out with a short-term fix, it'll subside. That feeling will go away, and then suddenly there are no complaints. And then one day we might get blindsided by it, which isn't great. So I think we need to take stock of this moment and remember it, because it will come back to haunt us down the line. But like Xbox have said, they are rolling out a new update, and yeah, it's just it's bizarre that they've not caught up with. They're not on the level with even Nintendo or Sony.
Well, it's not about being on the level. I just think Microsoft is a services network-driven company, right?
This is true.
I think it is part of the plan. And to be fair, their track record for their network infrastructure is actually very good. They have supported it better than Nintendo and Sony. So, I mean, I do have more faith in their actual network capabilities and keeping servers up and everything. But eventually, there's going to be a point where things are not accessible, I suspect. But we're talking decades from now. If it, I guess that raises the other concern again, just put back in the spotlight the fact that the system, if you have an Xbox One or Xbox Series console, I think Xbox One, that's been factory reset, or it's a new console and their server is not available, you can't set it up. So it basically is like a paperweight or e-waste, as MVG is described, where it can't be used. You can't set it up at all. And I think that is actually something that really needs to be fixed, because that can really hurt the long-term viability as a retro platform. And eventually, I do think, there's a time when smart delivery stuff's going to go away, right? And Xbox One games are no longer made. They're just going to make Xbox Series games. And then, at least on the disc side, we'll be set in terms of being able to play that stuff indefinitely. They just need to look at that console situation. So
yeah,
right. But there is that 2-year period, basically, perhaps even longer, depending on how long cross-gen continues, where there isn't actually a physical manifestation of the majority of the Xbox Series library. I find that immensely problematic for preservation purposes. And obviously, there's the short-term issue, which I think most people are probably more concerned about, which is that they couldn't actually play their games during this outage period, which says to me that there's too much reliance on the infrastructure, and there isn't a strategy for the worst-case scenario. which just happened. So, I think the key thing here is that if your infrastructure is awesome and it's 24/7 guaranteed, then it's less of an issue in the short term, but it isn't. We've now got evidence of that. There is a problem. There needs to be a fallback position. And I'm hoping that that's what we're going to get. I don't know. Bizarre, right? Just a bizarre situation that you own a console that you don't necessarily have access to play games on. It's kind of mind-bending from my perspective.
I mean, Rich, there is some precedence with this in other spaces, like the mobile space, for instance. Like, you look at what's available on iPhone in particular, and like, I've purchased plenty of mobile games in the past that are just gone from the store. You can't re-download them. They don't run on modern phones. They're basically gone, right? And, people say, oh, it's just mobile games. But I feel like we're heading in this direction in general, and it's a little bit concerning.
Yeah, absolutely. So another Microsoft story that turned up this week, a patent, which I find quite fascinating. It's a patent that would, the headline says that you can transfer your discs into the digital space, which is obviously quite important for a console like Xbox Series S. Let's say you're an Xbox One S owner, got a big bunch of physical games. You transition across to the Series S, which is a perfectly viable upgrade strategy. But you can no longer use those games, right? That goes against Microsoft's strategy of being able to take your games with you across the generations. Enter this patent, which I actually find to be, I don't know whether it's crazy or genius, where the strategy seems to be that you can take your physical games with you across to a diskless console by keeping the disc console and putting the disc in the tray, and then across the network, the Series S realizes that there is a disc in the tray and it allows you to download and play the game. John, thoughts? Mad genius? Interesting solution? Or what?
So,
I suppose it addresses the concept that your old console is e-waste. It isn't anymore. You need it to play disc games.
So this actually sounds like there was the thing going around before about taking discs into a retailer and essentially trading them in for a digital download, and that I'm firmly against. But this idea actually, I think, sounds kind of awesome, and it would actually be useful for us as well, since we cover Series S. I like that idea. I think that's a fun way to do it, to allow you to essentially keep your disc media, because let's say you're a longtime Xbox One owner, you have a ton of games on Xbox One on disc even, and then you decide, well, I'm going to buy Series S. This would allow you to essentially access all those games on the Series S with the benefits. So, in that sense, that sounds pretty good to me.
I think there'll probably be a case where they'll release a digital version of maybe Series X as well down the line. There may be more iterations of the console lineup where this becomes more relevant. And they don't want to be. Microsoft don't want people to be deterred by people losing their legacy games. So I think it might be a must to have some solution in place. That sounds a bit like putting it in another console with the disk drive. Sounds a bit of a roundabout way to do it, but it's quite funny. I like the idea.
It's kind of crazy and wacky, and but it does seem somewhat convoluted. But the alternative strategy is the thing that you hate most, John, which is the concept of taking a physical disc, and seemingly the concept is to nullify it by turning it into moving it into the digital domain.
That's what I was talking about. I think that's a terrible idea, because you're essentially reducing the number of games in the wild and also really creating e-waste right there, right? And that is an idea that is offensive to me.
But it might actually be compelling to some people who would want to transfer their games into the digital domain. I think from my perspective, the question is the logistics of how you do it. How do you target a specific disc and say, right, this disc is no longer playable on this system?
What I mean, it sounds like you turn it in and then they basically grant them access to the game digitally and then throw the disc out. They destroy it.
Right. Okay. But there was this whole concept of, the original Xbox One DRM, which did have the concept of transfer of ownership. But I've no idea how that was. I mean, it was never deployed. I'm just wondering if this concept of individually identifying a physical disk is actually still there and potentially viable for this transfer system. I should state that from what I've read of that patent, it just seems to be about using the Xbox One as a disk drive, basically, not a transfer mechanism. But interesting nonetheless. So let's move on to our next news topic, and this one concerns concerns that Nintendo is having about managing the next generation transition. And I guess, John, it is an interesting challenge. I mean, I think there's a logistical issue here, which is the question of whether Switch games will be backwards compatible on the new system. But then there is the kind of cross-gen issue, which is to say, are there going to be games that straddle two Switch generations as there are on PlayStation and Xbox? So I'm not quite sure which of those issues is concerning Nintendo the most. Both of them, I would suspect. But what's your thoughts on this?
I've seen a lot of conversation going around about this issue, and I do think this is one of those cases of, when trying to translate something from Japanese into English, and it's not easy. I'm terrible at it, honestly. But
and you speak Japanese?
Kind of, yeah. Not the best though. But essentially, when you use the word, I think there's an issue with specifically. There's a phrasing where they say "tosha no kadai," and kadai is like it can be like a challenge, a difficulty, a problem, but it doesn't inherently mean like a bad thing, right? And I think that's people took issue with that word specifically to mean like, oh, it's a concern,
a major concern, quote unquote.
And that's fully, totally accurate enough to say, but we can be missing the nuance, and I don't know exactly how, when you look at the whole thing in context, different ways to read it. I think they're essentially just saying that's their next challenge, is how do we move from a very successful platform like Switch into the next generation. And I think it's absolutely a fair thing to look at. Like, that's a difficult task, difficult challenge to overcome for Nintendo. And yeah, like, they haven't really been in this position for a while. If like you would say, like, the Wii, for instance, was successful, right? But it had the tail wasn't as long as you might have expected. And towards the end, it was sort of losing interest. People were losing interest in the Wii. So when they launched the Wii U, obviously they fumbled, but it wasn't quite the same situation. Whereas the Switch is essentially, like, I think their most successful game console ever right now.
It is, yes.
It's unbelievably successful. People love it. Following that up now is going to be really difficult for them. And that's the concern.
Just looking over some stats here, they've shipped over 103 million units, according to Video Games Chronicle, surpassing Wii's 101 million. And apparently Switch had 98 million users last year actually playing the system, which is quite phenomenal. So, yeah, I mean, I think that's the challenge, right? How do you take those 103 million people? It will be much more by the time the generation is complete.
Yeah.
I suspect that we might be looking at a generation that surpasses PlayStation 4 even. So, yeah, similar challenge. How do you take those users forward?
It's an interesting one.
And, well, what's your thoughts on this? How would you do it, Tom?
I mean,
you are Mr. Nintendo. You are Mario himself.
I couldn't even begin to imagine. But it does seem to me like the problem Nintendo have here is similar to the one Sony had with the PS1, where they, like, having such a huge install base with high expectations, it creates a challenge where they need to kind of... they need that back compat support in some way, but they have to invest a bit in the new console to support it a bit extra. Like, they had the PS1 chip famously inside the PS2 for hardware support, and so it might go for a Switch follow-up. The other issue is that like a lot of Nintendo's consoles, when they follow up with back compat support, like the Wii to Wii U, the DS to 3DS, they've often relied on similar input technologies where you can still use your Wiimote on a Wii U. You can still use a stylus on a resistive screen on the 3DS. So there's a question over what the next console iteration will do in terms of hardware input, and whether there'll still be a way to wrangle in the Switch's features with the Joy-Cons and the capacitive screen
I
and all
don't
that.
think that's going away, Tom. I think they found their model, and I just don't see them ever going back to just a console.
Yeah.
Because their handheld business is traditionally very important to them. But the problem they solved with Switch was like sort of combining the two, right?
Yeah.
Because they had development teams working on two platforms. Now they're consolidated into one, and I don't think we're going back. So
No, it's too good of a format, isn't it?
yeah,
But
exactly. It's really a good format. It's unique. I don't think Nintendo wants to or could compete on the power side of things right now. I mean, they haven't for a long time, but there's just no way they're going to put out like a Series X capable like machine, right? That's not happening. So I think they're going to stick with the hybrid design going forward. And the question I have is just about backwards compatibility. I kind of figured it would be a shoo-in, but it's not entirely clear now if that'll actually come to pass. And I think it would be a gigantic mistake to do that, to like cut off all those original Switch games.
it could go back to the idea that maybe cartridges aren't in the picture for Nintendo, and so they're thinking about an all digital. That would be a horrifying scenario, but I know.
I don't believe that, Tom. I genuinely don't believe that, because Nintendo themselves, they know their audiences and everything.
Yeah.
More so than the others. I don't think that they're ready to do that.
I'd be
Well, there
heartbroken.
is some additional flavour from the Atmosphere firmware hacking team. They've reverse engineered the Switch. They know everything about it, and curiously, they have seen no evidence of a next generation Switch within the Switch firmware, which is, they've basically been poo-pooing the, for want of a better phrase, the concept that there are dev kits out there, but we know there are dev kits out there. And their other point was that it seems that the Switch's entire sort of makeup is based around the Maxwell GPU. The next Switch will not have a Maxwell-based GPU, and it's got to be backwards compatible in some way, which I think is going to be quite a challenge. And because, typically NVIDIA, unlike AMD, don't generally tend to build in backwards compatibility into their architectures simply because they don't need to. So I'm going to be interested to see whether there is a logistical concern there in terms of implementing backwards compatibility, or whether they'll just simply get around it through software. Classic story. NVIDIA basically assured users of the 750 and the 750 Ti, those are Maxwell-based GPUs, that there would be hardware Vulkan support, but there isn't hardware Vulkan support for those GPUs. So what they did was they spent about, 6 months, I think is the amount of time spent on it, implementing a software layer to emulate Vulkan for just those two GPUs. And I actually took a look at it recently. It's not actually that fast, but it works, right? So I think backwards compatibility isn't necessarily ultimately a hardware solution, but might be software. I don't know, but I think the point is it's got to be in there, right?
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Okay. Yeah, absolutely. Right. Okay. Well, let me just go back to the docket and let's talk about the next story. Gotham Knights gameplay reveal. I think there was like 13, 15 minutes of gameplay footage came out. A lot of people quite excited about this. The gameplay reveal was also matched with a comment that the last gen version of the game has been canned. There's going to be no PlayStation 4, Xbox One. Got a question here from Modvan, DF supporter. Read Gotham Knights, you've talked a lot about how cross-gen games are being held back by having to work on last-gen consoles rather than focusing exclusively on current-gen. Since Gotham Knights was initially planned as a cross-gen title, would it be similarly limited in its scope or technology despite ultimately dropping its last-gen versions? And do you think this is a sign that the current-gen consoles are now considered financially viable enough for developers to finally move out of the cross-gen era? So I think there's 2 points here. First of all, what do we think of the gameplay trailer? And secondly, what do we make of this dropping of the last-gen consoles? Tom, did you take a look at this trailer?
I did. I had a look last night. I think I would echo what a lot of people thought when they saw it, in that it doesn't doesn't scream at you like this is obviously like now only on current gen systems, PS5 and Xbox Series X and S. It's just it doesn't look like it still looks like it's got that foot in previous generations, and that is a bit of. It seems like it's getting the worst of both worlds in that respect. In that it doesn't look like it's a really cutting edge creation, but suddenly the Xbox One and PS4 versions have been axed, and yeah, it's a very strange situation. I remember when Arkham Knights released back in 2015. Different studio, it was Rocksteady. This one's by Warner Brothers, Montreal, and there was a feeling that wow, we're looking at something quite exceptional here. Like it's a beautiful looking game, fully open world. Fast forward 7 years, and this looks very similar. And I could imagine this running on a PS4 and Xbox One, just as it did 7 years ago. So yeah, it's a very strange one. My only thought on why they maybe I don't know, but maybe they dropped the PS4 and Xbox One side is because there is a networking feature in this where like there's co-op, and maybe that was hard to wrangle onto a base Xbox One. But who knows?
I don't know. John, thoughts on this one?
So I guess the first thing to note is that this is not we've seen it, but it's not the next game from Rocksteady themselves, right?
Yeah.
So I wasn't necessarily expecting that kind of experience here, but these are the guys that did, I think, Batman Arkham Origins up in Montreal. I would say, looking at that gameplay trailer, I hate to say it, but it does not look as good as Arkham Knight.
No, I think you're right.
Like at all. Like it's honestly not even close. And I've seen Arkham Knight recently. That game holds up extremely well. It's genuinely stunning. This is not that. And it's kind of like, in that sense, it's hard not to feel like, man, what's going on here? This just looks like a mid-tier open world game set at night. And I'm not into all the skill tree nonsense in here either. Like it just feels unnecessary. There's not really good motion blur, which I just want to mention because that was something Arkham Knight did really well. I don't know. It's bland to me. I'm not really excited.
Well, I think that an issue I had with the trailer, I put it in the Slack yesterday, is why is it so jerky? I mean, it is running at 30 frames per second in that trailer, but it's skipping all the time. It looks really bad. And
So
I think it is running at a higher frame rate PC version, and they've just decimated the frame rate down to 30. That would be my theory, but I really hope the game doesn't run like that because that's not looking good.
yeah, I think this is actually a bad habit that a lot of companies still have these days, is they just upload their trailers at just straight 30 FPS. So they think, oh, we have a 30 FPS game or something like that, but it just doesn't work because you're not matching the actual refresh rate, right? Like even if you have a 30 FPS game, you still want to upload it at 60 frames per second or 60 hertz so that you get the correct frame cadence on playback. And here, that's not what you're getting. So it just looks really kind of choppy, not smooth. Yeah. I mean, I will say I am happy to see that they're leaving behind the last generation machines in a sense. And I would hope that would make their development processes a little bit less painful towards the end, because, you know, we have zero insight into this specific game, I should note, but just talking with developers that have done cross-gen stuff lately, that final push on those last-gen base machines is pretty difficult, right? You can spend that time elsewhere, and I that's good. I mean, I feel bad saying I don't think it looks as good as Arkham Knight. I don't think it's necessarily an ugly game. It looks fine. I'm not especially impressed by any of it.
Yeah.
And I do think, Rich, your point about the stuttery playback also just kind of negatively influences that, because it just doesn't look fluid, and that's a problem. So
Yeah, it's just the first impression, really, isn't it? It goes a long way. And like to go to the point about it being dropped on the base machines, it's true that we're so often we're accustomed to announcements that actually no, this game that you thought was next gen actually is coming to last gen now, and so that being the surprise. But to hear it this way round is, well, it should be good news, but I don't feel entirely excited about the game. So it's just,
I think the news is good in that it shows that publishers and developers are perhaps becoming more confident in the installed base, right? I mean, we know there's close to 20 million PS5s out there now,
Yeah.
probably. And Xbox, what they announced recently, their numbers as well, I think, that were quite high, over 10 for sure. Like that's a lot of, next gen machines in the wild now, right? Like not the same gigantic install base we've seen before, but it's still a lot. So I think it's finally, hopefully, reaching the point where it can be viable.
So it's out October, isn't it? October this year. Yeah, I'd imagine they had to maybe also trim back on the formats to cater for in the QA process to try and get it through on that. That's possible.
Yeah.
Well, I think it's simply the case that, and I actually applaud them for this. There's almost certainly a version of Gotham Knights appearing, sorry, not appearing, but in existence that runs on the base Xbox One and PlayStation 4. And it may well be that the quality threshold simply wasn't there. Because as you say, John, actually eking out that performance is really difficult. And we're seeing that it is leading to a degradation in the experience. I mean, a good example is Call of Duty Vanguard, right? That's a game that typically, I mean, a series that typically runs at 60 frames per second. And on base Xbox One, Vanguard definitely does not. It's more like in the 40s. It's really not, the kind of Call of Duty experience you would expect. And cutscenes are like in the 30s even. And PlayStation 4 is better, but really to get the actual Call of Duty experience that you want, you need a current gen machine. And, if it is such a struggle to maintain quality on those older machines, absolutely, it's time to draw a line on them because, it will dominate the discussion, right? I mean, that's going to be the issue. If you put out a poor version of the game, I mean, look what happened with Cyberpunk 2077. It's kind of less relevant now because more people have the current gen machines. But absolutely, it should be, the quality threshold has to be there for all players. And maybe you're right, Tom. Maybe there is a networking situation there where, if there is such a big performance differential between one generation and the next, how are you going to, that's obviously going to have implications on the networking side of things. There's a particular CPU burden on networking, which may well have been an issue there. I guess it's kind of just guesswork at the moment because we don't know. But I think generally the concept of binning off the last gen versions, they wouldn't have done it for no reason at all. So I'm glad that they did.
Yeah, it reminds me of actually this was a Warner Brothers joint as well, but Warner Brothers Games joint, Shadow of Mordor on PS3.
Oh God, that's the classic one, isn't it?
Yeah,
we always talk about that when it comes to cross-gen disasters.
I mean, yeah, that's that. Maybe they learned their lessons from that one. Like, I've not played a cross-gen game as bad as that. It was awful.
So, gents, this is also coming to PC, right?
Yeah,
it's Unreal Engine 4. What do you think? Is Alex gonna have to bust out his hashtag again?
I really hope not. I really hope not.
It's an open world Unreal Engine 4 game.
What could go wrong?
What could go wrong?
I don't know. We're in dangerous territory here. We could turn this into a massive rant, but yeah, I think we're going to be doing something a bit more substantial content-wise on that in due course.
We should have like a reward. Like if somebody ships a new Unreal Engine 4 game and it has 0 stutters, we should give them like the special Digital Foundry prize, like a miniature bust of Alex's head or something. I think that would be a fine prize.
Yeah, it's sort of like a gold-plated Alex head.
Exactly. That's what I'm saying. So, developers, if you're watching, if you could ship
if
Unreal Engine 4
a
PC
gold-plated version of Alex's head, you know what to do.
Oh, they'll get right on it.
Okay, let's move on to the next topic. So this is an interesting one. I've not had a chance to check it out myself, but the original 2001 build of Duke Nukem Forever has leaked 21 years later. And I believe there's some E3 2001 content in there. I've not looked at it myself. I'm fascinated to learn more about it, though. And John, you've obviously been all over this, right?
Yes, I have been playing this on my modern and retro PC. Now, it's true, there isn't much of a game here, as has been noted. I think George Broussard actually said, like, yeah, have fun fiddling, but there's not much here. That's not, it's true, but also not true, because there's a lot here. There's so much stuff in here. It's just not stitched together. The sheer volume of assets and scenarios they've created, and just the amount of things in here, like there's hundreds of maps connected together that you can like look at. It's absolutely packed with stuff, and all that E3 stuff is here in some form, and it really makes me feel sad about what happened in the end, because I feel like what they were going for was a little bit more like tongue-in-cheek, I think, than maybe the final game ended up being, where it just felt a little bit out of date. Like, it felt like they were taking the Duke concept in the right direction here, which I would have liked to have seen complete. But also, like, visually, they were doing some crazy stuff for Unreal Engine 1. Like the facial capture stuff, or however they did that, the facial expressions, they're really impressive. Some of the skyboxes, like that Vegas strip that was shown in that famous E3 trailer, like just seeing it here, it's like, man, what the heck? They really went crazy here. So it feels like a project where you had a ton of people working really hard that were awesome at what they're doing, but the overall vision just couldn't come together. You know what I mean? Like, there was nothing to really pull it all in. And, you know, obviously when games are in development, they're very much in flux like this, but it's just the amount of stuff that's done and looks as good as it does that really kind of surprised me. And I'm a little bit sad that this is not the version we got, because I think this could have been genuinely awesome. And I'm happy that it's out there now, because I think the source code is out there along with this whole project. So everything's out there, which means conceivably, a dedicated modding team could probably go in there, maybe, and stitch it together to become something more complete and fully playable. And to note, this is also something that's much further along than, say, the Half-Life 2 leak. You guys remember that? The 2003 Half-Life 2 leak, right?
Absolutely.
That was woefully incomplete and just like barely anything, really. This, though, you can really see what they were trying to do with Duke. So, and the menu system, my goodness, the game's UI, it looks like it just stepped right out of Windows XP. It's got all those like weird curves and like soft colors and like those like rendered icons, and it's absurd. Also, the in-game terminal stuff, that, oh man, so Doom 3 was known for this, right? It had those interactive terminal screens. They had a whole render just for that. Duke kind of had stuff like that already in this really old build. So, like, again, that's something else where they were kind of ahead of the curve in terms of implementing a really cool idea, like having in-world panels that were actually usable like that. So, yeah, there's a lot here.
So I guess my question is, how does it compare to the final game?
So, conceptually, you can see it follows a lot of the same beats, right? You got sort of the TV studio thing, you've got the casino areas and all that, you've got like sort of the outside of Vegas area and the desert, all that stuff. There's the turret-y kind of stuff. Like, there's a lot of sequences here that you can say, I see how they got to that final game. But what I think they were trying to do with Forever 2001 was create something that was a little more open-ended, where like you could kind of go back around inside of a pseudo large world. So it would have been a little less linear, I think, than the final game. And linearity is no problem, but just the way the final game came together, it misses the mark in so many ways. Even though I'm happy it exists. It is interesting. So
was it Unreal Engine 3, the final game? Or did they just build
I believe it was.
I feel like, I can't remember. I feel like it's actually like an older iteration of Unreal that was built upon. I can't say for sure. So
it could be like a BioShock situation where it's 2.5.
Yeah, that's what I'm thinking. Something like a BioShock, where it's like Unreal Warfare, the second generation Unreal Engine, but kind of modified to be their own thing. And I could kind of see that, given how bad the console ports of that game are. Like, they're completely like atrocious and basically unplayable. It was not good. Which is consistent with those consoles not really supporting that technology well. I mean, BioShock was okay on 360, of course, but not BioShock on PS3. That was oof.
So was it actually, I mean, is there any commonality between, aside from concepts and designs, the actual final product, new assets? Is there any of the old assets in there? Map design?
No, I think it's all completely different assets.
Wow.
Like,
okay.
so to me, it feels like they rebuilt this game multiple times, completely. Probably basing, okay, you can see that this is what they wanted to do in 2001, and then in building what we have now, they essentially rebuilt it with what they had learned by building it the first time and made some changes along the way. So
Yeah, it was a classic case of being too ambitious for its own good at every stage of development, because they had like the Quake engine to start, didn't they? On their first iteration.
Correct.
And that was the most cutting edge tech out there at the time. And then they see what Unreal's doing, and then George Broussard and his team were like, "Well, we want to have some of that. We don't want to be behind the times on our game when we release it." And it just seemed like it was always playing a game of catch up on whatever the latest tech was out there. Hence the cancelling of the Unreal Engine 1 version, which, yeah, again, it just goes back to looking at this build, the 2001 build. You can see all the set pieces they had in mind, like the driving set piece. There's all these little bits, and
motorcycle stuff is awesome.
Yeah, it's just like there's this mentality of just try and make the ultimate game, the ultimate shooter. We can do anything, interact with everything, and there was no real drive to rein it in a bit to ship a product, and so things got out of hand, and you're left too late to release a game, and by that point it's a bit out of date.
I'm really sad about it because you can really see the passion that was poured into making this game.
Yeah.
And you can tell, like, when some of the old devs speak about it, like, it was such a difficult time for them. I really feel bad for the situation. Nobody wanted it to end up that way.
No.
It's just, oof, what a crazy thing. And that period was really interesting for these sorts of games that were very, very hyped, and then they ultimately just didn't make the grade. Though I will say, compared to Duke Nukem Forever's final game, I think John Romero's Daikatana is much, much better, and actually a good game. So I will defend that game. I'm going to cover that someday on DF Retro, because I think it's actually good.
I mean, Daikatana's got so many weapons. How could it not be good?
I mean, the weapons are great. They are great. That game is good. It just shipped with some problems, and people were all like high on Half-Life. So
yeah,
like, well, we don't want these old school shooters anymore.
Fair enough. Okay, well, let's move on. So that's the end of the news topics this week. I think we could spend a little time talking about some of the projects we've been up to. Obviously, Alex isn't here at the moment, but FSR 2.0 is out. I have watched half of his video, which he put up for quality checking. And I'm quite impressed with what AMD has come up with here. It seems to be on par with Unreal's temporal super resolution technology, which is right up there with the best of the upscaling technologies that's out there. I think the big sort of surprise is that it seems to run faster on NVIDIA cards than AMD ones, which, that was an interesting conversation I had with Alex last night, which is to say, okay, Alex, looks like we really love FSR 2.0, but this running faster on NVIDIA thing, I've got a list of things that you need to test to make sure that this stands up. But I've seen some of the data this morning. It seems to be working. I think there's one thing about FSR 2.0 that I want to get out there, which is that it's not a proprietary technology. It's not built around specific hardware within a specific AMD GPU. It is universal. I think that is one of its strengths. So to sort of preempt any questions around it, yes, you can use it on a console. Conceivably, you could even use it on the Switch. The only real question there concerns the level of expense from compute, because it seems to be quite compute heavy there. But any thoughts on FSR, John, before we talk about some of your stuff?
I agree with you. Based on what I saw there, it actually looks phenomenal. Like it seems like a competitive, serious effort from AMD. It's a dramatic shift over the original FSR. I am, of course, curious about console performance. Like, what's the actual cost of utilizing it there? Because, we still get messages from people like, oh, this game has FSR 1.0 on a console. Are you going to test it? It's like, no, because it's not interesting at all. FSR 1 was not good. FSR 2, however, looks to be very good. So hats off to AMD for delivering something that's significantly better in that regard. As for the NVIDIA versus AMD in terms of performance on this, that does raise an interesting question though, right? Because if you have DLSS as an option over FSR 2.0, DLSS still seems to come out on top.
And it's faster, and its quality level seems to be a bit higher. Obviously, we haven't seen the final video yet, but I think just the fact that AMD is competitive without that machine learning component is impressive. Quite an interesting achievement.
Yep, I agree. So, yeah, the future's bright in that area. So, although, conversely, this was also the week we saw again that Intel's next GPUs are kind of delayed further. And that also means, I guess, we're not going to be seeing their solution for this for a while either. And I'm a little bit concerned about the Intel situation right now. I mean, I don't know what you think about that, Rich, but it is worrying.
The fact that they're launching it in China first is a bit of a red flag, right? I mean, why? There must be a strategic reason for it. Is it the case that, maybe the scrutiny in terms of expectations, rather, in terms of features, isn't quite as high in that territory? Maybe the software still needs more baking. Maybe some of the surrounding features need to be implemented and haven't been as of yet.
Maybe they're launching a lower end product first.
Maybe that, yeah. I mean, this is the thing that's kind of been a bit disappointing from my perspective, is that typically when a new architecture, a new technology is launched, the stack is, it starts on the top of the stack and works down. And that isn't what we've seen here. We've actually seen the lowest end laptop part, which doesn't excite anyone, right? It doesn't say, wow, here's something new and exciting. I don't know what to say about this. It's just slightly problematic. And I kind of expected more from Intel because this has been cooking for so long. And obviously earlier in the year, there was quite a big PR push behind it. We spoke to two of the leading people behind the project at Intel, and the fact that it's been delayed, pushed back, launches with an unexciting laptop part, I don't know. I really hoped to see more there, but what can we say about that? It's not especially thrilling, is it? And that's the thing, right? I mean, quite a lot of the industry is kind of built around excitement, about looking to the future, about seeing a new level of performance or features that we've never seen before. I think Intel could be doing a lot more, right? And even if the product has been delayed, there's better ways to manage that than, just sort of sheepishly admitting that, yeah, we're going to be late. Oh, and we're putting it out in China first. Which, it almost sounds like it's being sent out to die, which isn't the case. It can't be the case.
No, not without that investment. No way.
It's not a good look, is it?
It's just, but then like NVIDIA has their next generation stuff on the horizon as well, right? Like,
absolutely, yes.
This is going to be brutally difficult at that point to compete.
Well, we were talking with Intel about their process advantage. They're going to be on TSMC 6 nanometer, but if they're pushing back to September or whatever, they're going to be going up against 5 nanometer or potentially even 4 nanometer products from NVIDIA and 5 nanometer products from AMD. So, yeah, this
process is not differentiating anymore.
Yeah, that's no longer an advantage. And some of the performance uplifts that are being mooted for the next generation parts would push what we know of the higher end Intel part down into the mainstream, which, again, it's not a good look. It's just a bit sort of disappointing, really, right? I don't know. It's not great. Projects I do want to talk about before we move on, John, is what you're looking at now.
Yes.
Which is, I mean, your continued obsession with the PlayStation 3 is starting to become a little bit concerning.
Yeah, it's like something about this year. I got back into PS3 and I'm finding that it's actually pretty bad in a lot of ways, but and that's what makes it fascinating to me, right? Like there's so much weirdness with it. Like some stuff is great, but like the spectrum of quality is so vast and weird, and developers are doing so many different crazy things, and I am now finding that PS3 era fascinating again. So this current video is and it's very early in production right now. There's a lot to do on it, but the idea is I wanted to step back and look at the so-called 1080p dream, right? Because the PlayStation 3 was promised as a 1080p targeting machine. Like, you know, they never said like all the games are going to be 1080p or anything like that, but it was clear that they were pushing that number at launch. And as we know, the PS3 is not a 1080p machine. It's barely even a 720p machine in many cases. But there are actually a decent but relatively limited number of games that did actually target 60 frames per second, and that extends across the whole generation. And I thought it would be fun to actually go back and look at them, see what developers were trying, and sort of put it under the sort of like the modern microscope. Just kind of give it another shot and see what worked and what did not. Some games work very well, like obviously Ridge Racer 7 is my go-to example as a 1080p 60 game at launch. Conversely, also around that time, one of the ones I'm getting so many laughs out of is Full Auto 2, which is the direct inverse of this, which, yes, it runs at 1080p, but it is extremely cinematic at best, let me just say. So there's some issues there, and it's this variability that I'm finding very entertaining. So yeah, hopefully this video turns out to be sort of a fun look back at this kind of stuff. I also want to do sometime in the future, I kind of want to do a similar concept for the original Xbox with HD stuff. You know what I mean? 720p and 1080i games, because it's actually a similar situation. There's not many, but the ones that are there are pretty interesting. Of course, they never really promised those kinds of resolutions when the Xbox original launched, right? But it was supported and developers were able to pull it off. So I love this kind of stuff of trying to push the hardware in unique ways and pushing a lot of pixels to do some cool stuff. And yeah, so hopefully.
So I've been helping out a little bit with your 1080p video, and first I did boot up my PS3, and first impressions, I mean, that 1080p front end,
it's beautiful. Actually,
it's still really, really good.
It's shocking.
I'm really sort of, it's really impressive. It's stood the test of time. You know, they say that glass doesn't age. That front end really does look absolutely phenomenal. But, you know, the more I dig into this, the more bizarre situations crop up. So there's titles like Sacred 2. I was talking to you about that one yesterday, John, where it renders at 1080p with horrible tearing. And if you set your console to 720p, it super samples down from 1080p. However, if you set your console to 480p, it super samples down from 720p and has no tearing at all. So why not just produce the 720p mode at native 720 with no tearing? Doesn't quite compute. And then if you're at 480p but in 4:3 mode, it actually downscales from 1280 by 960. So these guys were super hardcore on super sample anti-aliasing. It's a really fascinating release. And of course, there's Cars Meta International, which you can't wait to look at 1080p.
Right. Yes.
But, you know, I think the other thing which sort of bemuses me is that if you set your PS3 to 1080p output, sometimes it would just go to 720p when you loaded a game anyway. Other times, it would try to do these bizarre 960 by 1080 upscales.
Yes.
Yeah,
Killzone,
we're going to look at that.
I believe had a similar mode like that. It might have been Killzone 2 or 3.
I think Uncharted did it as well. The worst example I think I ever saw was actually there's a Pirates of the Caribbean game that's less than 960 pixels across. I think it's 800 or 880 or something. Assassin's Creed, which had poor performance at 720p, they do that as well, I believe, at 1080, and it looks hideous. runs bad. I mean, let's just say PlayStation 4 really was a huge upgrade in so many dimensions of PS3.
Yeah.
But and I also want to look at some of the games that are 1080p but not full 1920, like
Right, of course.
like Lair, for instance, which has some sort of weird temporal frame combination thing going on with like 2 half-width buffers, I think, where it's like 960 by 1080, but they sort of jittered in a way to create a slightly higher resolution image that looks surprisingly good. There's Gran Turismo games, of course, which I think GT6 is like 1440 by 1080, which is pretty good actually for that.
Absolutely.
Stuff like that, it's a weird system.
Yes, Super Stardust as well. That was another sort of anamorphic 1080p title.
Well, that ended up becoming full 1920 by 1080 with the patch.
Oh, really?
It started off much lower, didn't it, on the horizontal?
It was lower, but but they managed to get it up to 1920 by 1080. And the reason is they added 3D support, stereoscopic 3D. And they needed to push up their rendering budget, and so they optimized the game further. And so if you play in 2D, you get higher res. I think they may have implemented like a split screen mode, or maybe that's just what they're doing for 3D. I don't know, but either way, the 3D stuff is also weird. Yeah, so there's a lot there. I hope this video turns out to be good fun, but it should be.
Yeah, but just imagine if you'd released it during the actual PS3 era.
Oh, those were turbulent times. I think we all had a good dose of that. The fanboy feuds that went on in the comments under every
The Sony Defense Force was quite a thing at the time.
That's the fun part about these retrospectives, is now I can lay it out without any fear of retribution. It's like it's completely free of that. I can just go nuts and have fun, and it's good and bad news depending on where you look, but it's interesting nonetheless.
Fair enough. Okay, well, let's move on to some supporter Q&A. This is where supporters of the DF supporter program basically pitch us with a bunch of questions every week. We choose the best, and here they are. The first one from Mendo Shilaro. I really do hope. I mean, I am notorious for getting pronunciations completely wrong, but the question is fairly straightforward. How do you feel about the current generation potentially being dominated by UE5 games? And I think there was that alarming stat that Epic themselves came up with, which is something along the lines of 48% of announced games are running on Unreal Engine. Tom, thoughts?
Bad.
You feel bad?
I feel bad about it, yeah. It's just that, I don't know, like the whole idea of reviewing technology and digging into each game and finding the merits, the pros and cons of what this game does well is so heavily tied into what the developer put into their own engine. I like it when developers make their own tech, and that uniquely becomes a springboard for great things from the game itself. The Unreal Engine 5 is an incredible catch-all tool, development tool. Obviously, it's worked well for fighting games, and in fact, just about every major fighting game from Tekken to Street Fighter to Soul Calibur's using it now. But I do miss the days of like booting a game and seeing what amazing things these developers did on their own terms, and the challenges, the ways they worked around the hardware, and like worked, sometimes in the early days straight to the metal on, some games. That's all kind of gone, and we've got this middle layer, which is Unreal, and I think it strips some identity out of some of these releases. I don't know. What do you guys think?
John, I'm curious about your perspective on this.
So I don't think it's going to be that different from what we have this generation. And I still think we'll see games running unique or bespoke technology. But what's become clear to me is that it's increasingly more difficult to maintain in-house technology, especially as things become significantly more complex, right? The problem I've seen and kind of heard about many times now is like, let's say you spend a large amount of money building an in-house team to create your own in-house technology. It includes, of course, the rendering tech and all that stuff itself, building all the tools, making sure everybody's trained and can use the tools, all that stuff. It's difficult, it's expensive. And then you complete that project, you get it out the door, and you kind of move on to the next project. So first of all, throughout the project, you've got to ensure that everything is properly maintained, documented, that you're not doing too much stuff that essentially breaks the engine in the future. I think this is the kind of stuff that CD Projekt ran into with their Red Engine, where just to get the game done, they incurred, as they say, all the tech debt, where it's essentially hacking stuff in to get it to work just for that game, but it's not really usable for a project going forward. But the bigger problem is, like, if you can't retain your staff, the guys that engineered this stuff, the guys that maintain it, and they leave, you're essentially left with holding the bag. And it becomes really difficult to keep that technology alive and support it. So this only really works if you have a successful studio that is actually making money back, or doing well enough with the releases that they can afford to keep these engineering teams alive, because Epic can throw around a lot of money. They have a lot of talent working for them. It's tough to compete there. So I see it being difficult for high-end AAA style games, things that are really pushing technology. But I still think there's plenty of space for this in the indie space, but also the moderate scale kind of area, or in the cases where a big company has enough money to support their in-house technology, which obviously, something like Ubisoft does, right? I mean, they have multiple engines in-house and they can afford to do it. Those companies can handle that. Square is in an interesting position, right? Because they have mostly moved to Unreal Engine 4, but or 5 actually. But then you have like Final Fantasy 16, which is based on I think it's like derived from the technology that was built for Final Fantasy 13 and also used in Final Fantasy 14. So it's like quite old. And then they still have stuff like, what is it, Forspoken, which is based on the Luminous engine, which was from Final Fantasy 15. And it's pretty clear that maintaining all this stuff is not easy for them. So I suspect, sadly, in that case, we're going to see future products after that just drop it altogether, right?
I'm kind of reminded more of the PS360 era, where Unreal Engine 3 was so prevalent. And to be fair, a lot of the games did look very similar, right?
Yeah.
I think that's the sort of concern that Tom has.
Also,
and it is a concern.
I would say large first-party studios, both actually Nintendo and Sony especially, I don't think we'll see them fully adopt Unreal Engine for their big titles because they have the teams in place.
Both have used UE4.
They have, but not widely.
Exclusively.
Not
I can't see Guerrilla Games or whatever moving across.
Guerrilla, Naughty Dog, Insomniac, like no way they're going to drop their in-house technology, I think.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, fair enough. From my perspective, how do I feel about it? I won't know how I feel about it until I actually start to see the games. I think the issue that I have in the here and now is that there are concerns about the performance of Lumen and Nanite, and the challenges in getting 60 frames per second from that technology. It's not looking good at the moment. I guess that's my number one concern there, and I'm going to be interested to see how they make that happen, because I'm sure it will happen, but how they actually do it is going to be quite interesting, I think. Okay, let's move on to the next question. It's a very quick one. I can answer it very, very quickly. Thank the Lord. Techno Dan asks, I currently have a Ryzen 3600, but my 16 gigs of RAM is only 2400 megahertz, as I kept it from when I used to have an Intel chip. Would it be worth upgrading to faster memory like 3600 megahertz? What kind of performance uplift can I actually expect? Or would I be better off putting the money into a faster processor? 2400 megahertz is too slow for a Ryzen 3600. 3200 megahertz CL14 or 3600 megahertz CL18, I think. That's your kind of sweet spot, and you will see a big performance uplift when you are CPU limited. But at the same time, Ryzen 5000 plus the extra memory would take you to plus the faster memory would take you to another level completely. So there's two upgrade vectors for you there. So yeah, spend more money is my recommendation. There's still a lot of life left in your platform, though. That's the good news. Let's move on to the next question here. Still CPU related, from Paul Calamato. Will there be a tipping point in the next few years where the strength of the CPU becomes as relevant to 4K gaming as it is with 1080p currently? And why do CPUs continue to be so underutilized at higher resolutions? This one should be fairly straightforward, right, Tom?
I mean, when you're looking at the resolution side, you're usually leaning on the GPU, and it's only with stuff like ray tracing and AI features and more systemic points in the game that the CPU is more utilized. I think there's a bit of a last gen, kind of a carryover from the focus on developing for last gen consoles. That means that we're still kind of not really tapping into our CPUs that much with a lot of games, and we're only going to see a push towards standardizing for PS5 and Series X CPUs that will have a knock-on effect for PC gaming as well. So I think there's an answer there, that we're still being kind of held back by those Jaguar cores on last gen.
Right, so the design of the games for the last gen systems means that the current gen CPUs aren't really being stressed at the moment.
Yeah, that's my gut feeling right now anyway.
I think from my perspective, it's a tricky one because 4K gaming, I mean, if you're running DLSS in performance mode, you've got a 1080p internal resolution, but your output resolution is something that looks very close to 4K. And therefore, if you're looking for extra speed, you could well hit a CPU limit because the GPU limit has actually sort of dropped down. So I still think the strength of the CPU can be relevant once you're talking about 4K or rather upscaled 4K on maybe a high refresh rate display, because you will hit the CPU limit there. But from a console perspective, I think you're quite right. I think the thing that changes everything, though, is going to be Unreal Engine 5, because it's so heavy on the CPU. I just can't quite get my head around that at the moment. Any thoughts on that, John?
Yeah, I mean, it's just, resolution is something that's constrained by the GPU, right? It's bottlenecking there. And I suppose if you offload enough GPU tasks to your CPU, you kind of play with the balance of where you're bottlenecking your game. So,
yeah.
So normally, at 4K, it's not the CPU that's getting stressed, because that's not the stressor in that case. So,
but I guess my point is, going forward, the nature of 4K is that it's not actually 4K anymore.
You're not actually doing all those raw pixels any longer.
Yeah.
And as you say, with a lot of the new modern techniques like Unreal Engine 5, just ray tracing in general, those place a heavy demand on the CPU. And so that suddenly becomes the bottleneck. I mean, all of this is just about putting the resources where in the correct bin, right? So balancing what resources you're using and how to hit the best possible target. And if you're too heavy in one area versus another, you're going to hit that bottleneck first, and it's going to have whatever knock-on effect, you'll get. So.
Absolutely. Next question from Dirk Hodoin. Do you think there could be a market for standalone ray tracing cards like there was for PhysX back in the day? Wow. I remember actually there was, you could actually use a second GeForce GPU just for PhysX. That was kind of crazy. Anyway, going back to the question, I imagine there's a niche of people who'd be happy to buy a whole GA102 die crammed with nothing but RT cores that interface with this is crazy stuff, that interfaced with an existing GPU via PCIe 5.0. I know that personally I would be interested in that. Okay. Yeah. Yes, but no. I think that the main issue is that the RT core is actually integrated into the GPU itself, into the shaders or into the shader blocks, and there's a lot more to ray tracing than simple acceleration of rate reversal. It's all tied together. So I actually think that having ray tracing as a secondary piece of silicon could actually be introducing further bottlenecks. I don't know what you think about that, John.
Yeah, that's exactly what I was thinking. I mean, conceptually, I like the idea, especially like I could see if it were feasible to have a use case where SLI returns, but specifically for ray tracing, right?
Right.
Because the issue with SLI has always been sort of synchronizing the output from the two cards, and you end up with micro stutter and other problems. And it doesn't really work with a lot of the modern rendering techniques. But I like the idea of this, but I just feel like there's going to be some sort of, again, bottlenecks here that'll prevent this from working as well as it sounds like it might on paper. But moreover, I don't think there's a market for this specifically, especially like we're having a difficult enough time convincing people to embrace ray tracing as is. There's still a subset of PC gamers that think it's overrated and not worth touching. I think all of us would say that they're wrong, but
I think the other thing is that supplementary purchases tend to always fail.
Yeah.
I mean, this is like the 32x of ray tracing, isn't it?
Or they get
That's a bad idea.
folded into the main product eventually, if they're that compelling.
And SLI itself was like this, really, right? Like most people didn't invest in it, and it was difficult to support, and it just ended up being a bad idea. It only ever worked when it was scanline interleaving on the Voodoo cards.
Fair enough.
With that being said, I do love the idea like those physics cards were so decadent. Like you knew you were really like hardcore into PC gaming if you owned one.
Yeah, if you want to play GRAW 2, Ghost Recon Advanced Warfighter 2, the God. PC version with physics, you could do it.
Yeah.
Wow. I don't know why, but that just does not excite me on any level. But there we go. Let's move on to the next question. This one from Flo G. Actually, yeah, good question. Can the VRR implementation of the PS5 ever be as good as the one from Xbox? What will need to be changed and how feasible / likely is it? So I guess, first of all, John, why would we say that the VRR implementation on PS5 isn't as good as the one from Xbox? What's the difference there?
It was a floor of 48 hertz, basically.
Right.
Fundamentally, it's the problem. There's no like inherent low frame rate compensation. So if you go out of that target zone, you just get stuttering again, essentially, or judder. That's the problem. And to answer his question, I absolutely think they could fix it. There's nothing about the hardware that would prevent it from actually working. This is a software thing. And Microsoft's engineers just, they've been doing this for a while. They implemented VRR on Xbox One X first. And I guess the S supports it too, right?
Yes, it does. Yes.
Wow. Yeah. See, that's great. And then we know they partnered with LG. They worked on this stuff leading up to launch. They've done a great job there. And I think Sony was just late to the party and did a very standard implementation that has room to improve.
But to be fair, they did say, right, okay, maybe there is something developers can do with it. So they opened the door to developers to produce bespoke modes.
And that's this actually goes back. We were just talking about PS3. It's the same kind of thing here, right? 360 was like you set your resolution, everything scales to that. PS3 was like you just pick whatever resolutions you support, and we'll potentially work with what's there. Maybe, not always. And that happened a lot.
There was a bug in the scaler, wasn't there? It could only do horizontal scaling.
Yeah, exactly. So that created a lot of issues back then. And it feels like it's a similar thing here. It's like, well, if developers want to take the time to implement this, they can work around the issue. But the default way is just like this. So we'll see.
Fair enough. Well, let's move on to the final question, and it's a good one from Agsma. With the sudden leak of Duke Nukem Forever's 2001 build, I wonder which other unreleased games / early builds that you guys would love to see the light of day, since many sought-after cancelled games have found their way to the public, like Rare's Dinosaur Planet and the GoldenEye remake last year. Personally, I'd love to see the early builds of Maxis Spore, which were nothing short of mesmerizing to me back in the day. Tom, any thoughts on this?
Yeah, there's a slew of games that came out, were announced around 2000 up to 2010, and especially going into that PS3 through PS3, where developers really struggled to get the most out of that hardware. My first thought was Final Fantasy Versus 13, the sort of alternative release by Tetsuya Nomura to the main Final Fantasy 13 game. And it kind of manifested eventually as a Final Fantasy 15, but it was a very different beast by that point. And a lot of the sort of concepts and ideas were in the final game, Final Fantasy 15. There was still the main character Noctis, and everything kind of linked in a little bit, but there was a lot of elements in the original Versus 13 trailers which looked so different, a lot darker. And I would love to have seen what they had made up to that point of that game, but I don't think it's ever going to happen.
So it's going to be party time with you on this question, right, John?
Oh yeah, absolutely. So just a few of the ones I want to see. First, I'd love to get my hands on the 90s version of Prey from 3D Realms with their portal technology. I know that's out there, but it's not. It doesn't exist for the public in any way, so that's a shame. While we're on the 3D Realms topic, I would like to see Remedy's Max Payne, the 90s version, which looked very different. I'd be curious to see how that plays out. Going up, Outcast 2 on PlayStation 2, if you remember that. It's a sequel to Outcast, which was the voxel-based PC game from 1999 by Appeal. I love that game. And Outcast 2 was a beautiful looking, like what they showed on PS2 looked amazing, and I'd love to see what was there for myself. And then moving ahead, things like Frame City Killer on Xbox 360 from Namco, which was that open world Unreal Engine 3 game that they announced at launch. It got canceled, disappeared, never saw it again. I'd be curious to see what was there. Same with Coded Arms Assault for PlayStation 3, which was shown, I think, when the system was revealed, and I was mesmerized by that trailer. It's really good. I don't know how much was complete on the game. And since it was supposedly using Unreal Engine, I can imagine they were having serious problems on the PS3 getting it to run well, because those early Unreal games in PS3 were pretty bad. There was also that there was some Ubisoft game we saw at the PS3 reveal. Remember, it's like the guy with all the pistol whipping action where they shoot through the glass bridge. It was from Ubisoft. I'd be curious to see if anything was really done on that. Just there's a ton of games like that obviously just were canceled, went away. We never saw anything more. There was even that one. There was some first-person game announced by Sonic Team. Do you remember that? With like ghosts and stuff. It was like some sort of like shooter with like spirits that was also shown early on for PS3, and it just disappeared. Like, just the idea of Sonic Team doing that always was weird, but I would have been interested to see what became of it. So, yeah, that's some of the stuff.
I'm just looking at through a list. Cheating is what I'm doing right now. But there are a few like reminders of some big ones. StarCraft Ghost, like that.
Oh yeah, Ghost.
Famously, it seemed like it was so close, but they couldn't couldn't quite get it over the line. Real shame. Scalebound, obviously quite recent, and it may come back. Platinum Games, Scalebound, Xbox exclusive. For whatever reason, just fizzled, and I've not heard anything from it since.
I'd quite like to see a whole bunch of arcade prototypes. A lot of them did go out on test. I actually played the original version of Virtua Fighter 1 that had the Arab character in it that actually ended up in Fighters Megamix, if you recall. So this was actually an arcade show called ATEI.
Oh yes.
And so there was it was actually quite a different game, and it's quite interesting to see how these games evolved over time. But they did actually go out on tests, so they did actually exist. So, but obviously it's a sort of area where people didn't actually, it's very difficult to get hold of those prototypes, I'd say. So there's a lot going on there. But yeah, that's just a thought I had. But yeah, there's so many. Where do you start? I mean, I saw a version of Elite on Super NES that was full shaded polygon 3D.
Wow.
That was an early tech demo. It didn't really do much, but I was present at the official Nintendo magazine when the guy from, I think it was Frontier, came in to show it. And I do believe I know who's actually got that demo because he left it. I don't know if anything will ever happen with it, but yes, it does exist. So yeah, that would be really interesting. But yeah, I mean, man, this is a mega topic.
Do you remember FX Fighter? There is a PC game called FX Fighter, but there's actually footage out there of FX Fighter for Super NES using the Super FX chip with vastly simplified characters. But it was a polygonal 3D fighting game that was coming to Super NES at one point. It's gone. It would have been cool to try that.
And I think obviously the holy grail still remains whatever exists.
I know, yeah.
The Saturn version of Virtua Fighter 3.
Oh, this mystery. We'll never know.
I don't think it exists. No. I think maybe there's some kind of character rendering demo, but I don't know. People insist that the project was rebooted twice. And there is something out there, but I don't know.
Probably.
I mean, at the very least, I'd like to see Shenmue on Saturn. I mean, we've seen the video, but like actually getting a released build of something would be awesome.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. I mean, we could be at this all day, but let's call it there. And that's the end of the show. Please do like, subscribe, share if you enjoyed the content. Ring the bell for those notional instant notifications. You may or may not get an instant notification. That is my disclaimer. Do you have supporter program? Join us, get involved, join our amazing Discord, join our community, see a bunch of bonus material, early access, huge amount of amazing stuff going on there.
The Discord is great. I got to give an extra shout out. Those guys are awesome. We have all kinds of fun over there. And there's even a brand new channel on the Discord you're only going to find on this one. It says dedicated channel to the FM Towns Marty. Check it out.
Well, that's essential then. I expect our supporter program membership to double in the wake of this shock reveal.
Absolutely.
Awesome stuff. But yeah, I mean, it is just an amazing community and we're so proud of it. But yes, that's all from us for now. And yeah, we'll see you next week.